Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I know many people are very busy in this industry at the moment, but it's really good to see such a good turnout. Welcome to the 2016 CIBSE Annual Lecture. Our guest speaker tonight is Fiona Cousins, who will be presenting intriguing insight into how building services engineers can save civilization. Fiona Cousins is a principal in the New York office of Arup, where she leads the sustainable team and is one of the leaders of the buildings practice. She has worked for both corporate and institutional clients on a wide variety of building, planning and sustainability projects, including museums, galleries, archives, trading floors, laboratories, libraries, performing arts centres, energy master plan and campuses. Fiona is a lead accredited professional and has led a number of projects pursuing the highest level of lead goals. Fiona serves as the chair for the New York chapter of the US GBC Urban Green for 2 years, and she is currently chair of the US GBC. Fiona is a frequent presenter on transformative sustainable building design and has presented technical papers in the areas of low energy design and sustainability. She holds a degree in engineering science from the University of Cambridge and has spent her career engaged in HVAC design and sustainability. One of her most memorable projects is Princetown University Frick Chemistry Laboratory. Throughout 6 years of design and construction, a large design team, 2 architects and 11 Arup disciplines, based both in London and New York, worked together to deliver something that is dear to my heart, a building that achieved performance by collaboration. When not doing all these incredible things, she can be found in a kayak somewhere off the coast of Manhattan. Ladies and gentlemen, Fiona Cousins.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out. Putting together a talk like this, especially one with a big mixed audience, is always an interesting challenge. So some of me wanted to talk about really super technical stuff, and slides might go forward if I'm lucky. If I press the forward button, they will. And another part of me really wants to, the super technical stuff and the really cool things that we do at Arup. And then that's some of these projects. This is one of the first ones that I worked on when I came to Arup with Alistair, who's in the audience somewhere, and something a little later. This was a project that we just finished just on the coast, luckily, of Miami in southern Florida. And then, if I'm not talking about projects and I'm not talking about super technical stuff, there's the US GBC part of me that says, well, we've got to transform the building market and lead is the way forward, and you have to do this. But I didn't want to really talk about any of those things. My whole career really has been about low energy design and how perhaps as building services engineers we might be able to save civilization. So the starting point should really be, what is the threat to civilization? And I don't think it's a big leap for any of you that the main threat to civilization is really climate change. The planet itself will be fine. And the main causative factor of climate change, unless you happen to be Donald Trump, is energy use. And this chart shows that basically anything that isn't dark orange is energy-related carbon emission effects. So 75% of the effects of the greenhouse gas emissions effect is to do with energy use, and about 40% of that in developed countries, and developed countries use much more energy than undeveloped ones, is in the buildings industry and within buildings, and therefore as building services engineers we must have something to do with some of the things on that chart. We've also, as engineers, especially those people who are actually building services engineers, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we get to low energy, and we have all sorts of charts and things that are like this that say, this is the order that you have to go in if you actually want to reduce energy to zero. This is how you get to net zero energy. So it's, in some ways, it's a solved problem, right? We know we're part of the solution. We have a big impact. We know how to get to zero, so that's all we need to do. And I could stop my talk right there. Go ahead, go save civilization. And I think that part of the problem is that the solutions are actually quite difficult. There's nothing, the technical ones we probably do have somewhat solved, but the political and social and personal ones are much, much more difficult to get your head around. So when problems are this difficult, there is one very good approach, which we've used a lot, which is to stick your head in the sand and say, well, yeah, it's not happening and it's nothing to do with me and everything that I do is actually too small anyway. So that's one possible approach that we could take. And then there's a second approach, which I think is dear to the hearts of many building services engineers, is as the climate gets worse, more and more people will need air conditioning. More and more people will want to live in enclosed bubbles, and we will be the heroes of movies like Brazil, for those people who can remember that far back, The Matrix, where everybody lives in an environment like that, The Hunger Games, The Incredibles, all of those places have completely false environments, and they all rely on people like us. So the second approach is something like this. You just brute force your way through the problem. So I don't think that that's the right answer, and I'm hoping that you don't either, but it probably means that I'm perhaps a little bit ambitious in my title and that maybe we can only save civilization, probably. So I think that the ability of large groups to act together for their common interest is really what civilization is all about. And I think that it relies on sort of these three things. It relies on institutions, information, and infrastructure, and this is sort of core work from some of the resilience work that I have done. And what I'm about to show you is some infrastructure projects that if you just think it a little bit about it, you'll come to the conclusion that actually the infrastructure was great and the engineering challenge was there, but actually what enabled them to be built was the social structures that were around them and the political structures that were around them. So here's the first one, which is also sort of a Donald Trump illusion, because he wants to build a wall about this long across the south side of the United States. But it's a great wall. It was built primarily for political purposes. What it looks like now is a work of engineering. There are sort of happier things that you can do. These are the aqueducts of Segovia, and it was really all about, can we deliver water? This is a building services engineering problem. There's this place here, which is Aphrodisias in the back end of Turkey, and this also was about how do you use your civilization to control large areas of the countryside through trade, through infrastructure, and you end up with an expectation that there will be some leisure and some games. It's about providing real infrastructure for society. So this is what I really mean by civilization. And then the last example of what do I mean by civilization is the London Underground. That may be not how you experience it most mornings, but it's about getting people to places that they need to get to. It's a piece of infrastructure that actually enables a lot of societal activity to happen. So that's infrastructure and the stuff that we have, and it's expensive and it's difficult to construct, and it supports our society. And there's a sort of a second part to this. If this is civilization, what's really under threat about it? And I've said it's climate change, but the other part of it being about climate change is really about sea level rise. So these are the regions that are vulnerable to sea level rise around the world. I don't think we're too worried about the north coast of Russia. There are not so many people up there. But almost everywhere else that looks vulnerable to sea level rise, there are actually an enormous number of people. And I found this diagram, which is a little bit washed out, but it shows cities over 10 million people where more than a few % of the people would have to move uphill if there was a 2-degree change in temperature. And what this actually shows when you add all the numbers up is that about 25 million people would have to migrate in order to deal with the effects of a 2-degree change of climate, which is huge in comparison with 25 million people is 5 times the population of Ireland, about the same as the population of Spain, and very much larger than the population of Syria. So this becomes a huge civilization-threatening problem. In New York, because that's where I live, and therefore how I think about it, this is downtown where all of the financial institutions are, and you can see that many of them end up underwater with a fairly small sea level rise and one that's very much within the predictions. And this is the kind of scene that ensues. This is the Superdome right after Hurricane Katrina in, where is it? New Orleans, in Louisiana. So I don't want to paint too bleak a picture, but this is the apocalyptic thing that we're trying to avoid. I've also been told that you should never show apocalyptic pictures if you want to encourage people to do things, because it actually just makes them want to bury their heads in the sand a little bit more, but I couldn't resist it, so you have them. So what is it that we actually need to do? We have some of the tools that we need. What is it that we actually have to do? So I think there are two things that we have to get our heads around. One is we need to leverage the tools and technology that we have a little bit better. And the second thing that we have to do is get policy right. So leveraging the tools and technology is an area of comfort for engineers for the most part. Getting society to set big, hairy, audacious goals together is not something that engineers are necessarily very comfortable with. But I think we can take a bit of a leaf from the moonshot people. Key practical players in getting to the moon were the rocket scientists. But it took a whole lot of other people to see why it was important to the US, and then a whole other set of people to formulate the actual problem, which was to get a person to the moon and then bring them back alive. And it was the return journey that was causing the rocket scientists' problem. And it was formulating the problem in that way that allowed them to get further forward. So I think our problem is sort of the same. The key practical players in saving energy in buildings are the people in this room, but we need to reframe the question so that other people will come along with us. So what does that mean? This, starting with the sort of leveraging technology and tools piece, many of you will have heard of Disney. And there's a piece of Disney that's called Disney Imagineering. And I heard a story not so long ago where one group of people at Disney Imagineering have T-shirts that say, "We make the magic." And then there's a whole other group of people at Disney Imagineering that says, "We make the magic work." And those are the engineering people and the people who actually maintain it. We're the people with the T-shirt that says, "We make the magic work." So we tend to be in service of the things that society wants us to do, whether it's the Great Wall of China or ideas like these, which is the Low Line, which is a park that's below ground and therefore doesn't actually have any light, although the picture looks like it does, and the Plus Pool, which is a self-sustaining clean water pool that happens to sit in the middle of New York Harbor, which is not actually the most polluted water in the world, but it isn't very clean. So they both look quite finished. I mean, the images are very seductive. It looks like all the problems are solved and that this piece of imagination is something that could really happen. But I can tell you that neither of these things actually work yet, and that the challenge to us as engineers is to turn these pictures into something that actually properly makes sense. So one of my colleagues put this a slightly different way in an article that he wrote recently, which is that engineers are basically the world's best comedy straight man. We are at our best. And what our job is that whenever somebody throws something at us, we have to take a leaf out of the improv book and we have to say, yes, and this is how we're going to do it. So all sorts of engineers do that, and we've all been doing it a really long time. So I'm switching out of building services because nobody ever sees the stuff that we do, at least not if we do it right. So switching to something that we do see. Sydney Opera House is a good story about, we started with an idea. Nobody really knew how to build it. It went through a whole series of new tools, existing tools, new technology, and eventually got us to the point that we had something that could be built and is world famous. So there are new tools and old tools. And I think that one of the problems that we have as a profession is that most people think of engineers as the people who use these kinds of tools. And there's nothing wrong with these kinds of tools. They're incredibly useful to do those kinds of things. But actually, we're the people who use these kinds of tools, and who invent the problems that these tools then go off to find the content for. So we might use drones to do our surveys, we might use iPads to do our building inspections, we might actually use a VR headset not to play a game, but to visualize a real future potential state and really properly understand what that's going to be and imagine it into being. So that's the first bit. We're sort of comfortable with that. It's the tools and technology. As engineers, we know how to make that happen. The second big thing we have to do is to get policy right. And there are a few historical examples. I'm going to show you two that show how new discoveries followed by advocacy can lead to fairly rapid action. So this is really all about getting the communication right. This is the bit that as engineers we don't do so well. So the first example is the Environmental Protection Agency. The thing that happened is that we got perspective on the world from space, and it looked awfully small. It looked like the photo from sort of one spaceship to another, and the environment clearly begins to look at risk. And about 5 years after the Earthrise photo was taken, the Environmental Protection Agency was born in the US, and the two things are pretty strongly linked if you look at the details of how that happened. The second example is about the hole in the ozone layer, which was mathematically predicted in about 1974. They figured out how to model it and produced the picture in 1984, and actually it was once they had the picture that they began to move towards actually having a solution. So about from 1984, the Montreal Protocol was established in 1989, and there were no more CFCs in 1994. So the whole thing took about 20 years, but it was about 5 years from the moment that that first picture appeared. So all of that is actually by way of preamble. So the story that I've told so far is that there is a serious threat to civilization. As engineers, and particularly as building services engineers, we hold some of the keys to solving it. It would be really easy to hide our heads in the sand and do nothing because it all feels a bit futile, and perhaps because it feels like we don't have all the skills to get it done. But this is the greatest challenge of our generation and the next generation, and we have to do something, or at least I think we have to do something, and I don't have all the answers. This is very much an opinion piece, but I have been thinking about this for quite a long time, and Nick spoke about some of the roles that I've held and hold now around USGBC Chair, Urban Green Chair, Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, a Buildings Equals Energy exhibition, a book that we wrote about climate change, the fact that I've also been a rowing nut and a kayak teacher, which is actually about communication in most cases. I've had lots of project roles and a long-term specialization in low energy buildings. So taking that as my starting point, this is what I think we should do. The first thing I think we should do is we need to properly know our stuff. And the second thing we have to do is we have to do it well. And the third thing we have to do is to inhabit our role. So I'm going to start with knowing, because knowing is the platform that engineers tend to stand on. We use our skills to give us both credibility and confidence. What does it take to get us to a place where we know enough to be credible? So the first rule is to be curious. And I think it's a good rule for life in general, but my point here is that we need to be curious about the whole breadth of our work. So if we take building services engineering as an example, what is our actual exam question? We're trying to make people comfortable at the lowest possible energy consumption, I think is broadly how you might state it. And we know that comfort results from the interactions of the building, of thermal mass, of sunlight, of glazing, air movement, humidity, and furnishings. And some of the problems about that are pretty apparent from this photograph. This is a greenhouse that needed to be made comfortable. It's a beautiful building. The point of it is actually about the view, not about the comfort. But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make a comfortable environment at the lowest possible energy use. The energy use also results from all of these things that I've just mentioned, and especially how these are interlinked with the systems and their components and how they're controlled. So in other words, even when we're doing our core thing, we only have partial control over our results. So what we analyze to decide on our systems, which is the spaces that people are actually going into, is not what we're actually designing. The architect and the interior designer have huge influence over that. And the operations depend entirely on the commissioning agents and the operators, and somewhere between those two things, the contractor actually has to build it. So we have a whole set of problems as building services engineers, and I think my laundry list of things that we have to be expert in is buildings physics, comfort analysis, systems thinking, the acoustic effects of air movement, hardcore building services system design, the actual technology of it, three-dimensional visualization and constructability, the contractual relationships, energy calculations, communications, and collaboration, and probably a whole bunch more things, but that's where I got to, and it's a pretty broad list. And not everything on that list can be taught through an academic program, and it's difficult to work through the best way to approach what I might describe as escalated communication at any time, but the right time to do it is probably not while they're at college, because they might never enter the industry in the first place. So, even within the technical part of the work, a surprising amount of the work needs us to be curious about how things work and how we might do them differently, and this means that we need lots of ideas and we need to test them. Our work is not that dissimilar to Edison's, even if it's mostly done at a computer or on paper rather than as an experiment. So the need to encourage curiosity tells us a few things about the kind of environment that we have to create for ourselves and for our staff. So we need to make environments where people are encouraged to have ideas and pursue them to a conclusion. And I've seen this live at our design school, so this is Arup staff, their annual events where we ask people to solve design problems in small groups and to test their results. They do it in a pretty hands-on way. And it's amazing what amount of learning actually happens when you get people, adults, to play at this level about how you actually might solve something. And I think that this idea of play is something that we don't bring enough into our everyday work. The other thing that we have to do to encourage curiosity is to when somebody has an idea, we have to provide some way of supporting that idea so that they can research and actually find out whether it makes any sense or not. And that brings me to the second part of knowing. Headings at the bottom of the page, which is to share what we know. So as professionals, and especially as professionals who think we might be able to save civilization, we really have to share what we know. And there are many reasons for doing this, but I'm going to talk about 3 of them. So most of our learning is on the job. And we have to if we are to reach mastery, we have to experiment. Senior people can set a really strong example about how to apply curiosity so that they actually know some of the places, some of the blind alleys you shouldn't go down, probably because they went down them themselves. And the sharing of knowledge is important because it's much easier than starting from scratch. So mastery of the subject is a requirement of innovation. If you don't understand how something works, you can't change how it works. And mastery comes from practice, from doing many, many iterations of calculations for different solutions until you really understand the problem without the calculations. So my example is, it's not possible to imagine a bicycle kick until you can kick the ball when you're going forwards. And it's not possible to imagine a solution using thermal mass and how that works unless you've seen it in action. And as it's hard to build repeatedly and actually experience all sorts of different examples of thermal mass, you probably do that experimentation through computer. And I spent my first year doing comfort analyses for highly glazed spaces, and my second year thinking about double skin facades. And I no longer actually need to think about what they might do because I've already studied it in some depth. I can actually now think about how to make them work. And I think that this getting far enough into a subject that you can really understand about how you make it work is this idea of how you get to mastery. So my second thought about senior people, and I really actually don't think that people should do just this, is that senior people can set a really strong example about how to apply creativity, curiosity, that too. So my most respected colleagues and collaborators are always looking for different ways to do things. They think about how to look after their creativity and to make sure that they have time to think about problems. And time to think about those problems obliquely and with different starting points. They're very practiced at finding new ways to look at things and in finding new people to help them look at things differently if they can't get it out of their own heads. They look at the problems at the edge of industry and they set up teams to work out how to apply the latest research in a practical way. So this is the competition for the US Embassy in London. This is the competition scheme, which is the bit that I had most involvement with. And we spent an enormous amount of time on this project thinking about ETFE and photovoltaics, and whether you could put ETFE and photovoltaics together in order to solve the very, very well-rehearsed problem of how you shade an all-glass building in a far northern latitude to solve both glare and solar gain. It's not going to look like this. It sort of looks a bit like this now, but it's not going to look quite like this. But this is the competition scheme. So that's the second reason. And the last main reason to share knowledge is to make sure that we don't reinvent the wheel. And I know that somebody is going to tell me that these are not wheels but tires, but that's the challenge of speaking to engineers. But it's mainly so we don't reinvent the wheel as a tire. The second part of this, not reinventing the wheel, is innovation tends to build on itself. So it's very hard to see that in building services and design. As I said before, we often don't see what we have, but it's pretty clear how this is not the Cutty Sark, and that there were probably a number of steps that happened in between. We didn't go from the Cutty Sark to this in one step. It happened a little bit at a time. The third part about knowing is about finding collaborators. So the right collaborators stretch us by asking new and different questions. And some of our collaborators might be people that we hire, like these superheroes, and the teams that we build. If we want an environment where people know and people share what they know, those are the people that we have to hire, people who A, have curiosity, and B, are happy to share what they've learned when they've applied their curiosity. So it's really unlikely that we would ever want this many Batmen, because they all have the same superpower, and they all have the same flaw, and so we need to be diverse as we put our teams together. So there are some qualities that we want in everybody, and some qualities that we only want in some, or some mix of qualities that we want from the rest of the people. Some of our collaborators might also be the people that hire us. At their best, they set big goals. This is one of the lessons of the USGBC, is that it's been a good way to help set big goals. And then they hold both themselves and their design teams and you and everybody else to meeting them. So this is the Bloomberg Center in New York, which is a project that I'm just in the middle of with Morphosis. And the Cornell University started by saying we want to be zero net energy, we want to be the greenest building ever, and they actually put all of that into the contract. And we have gone through the design process and got to a stage where we have actually been pushed at every single point because we've had a different set of outcomes in mind to the outcomes that we might otherwise have had. Those big goals set at the beginning really made a difference for us and for the design team. So that's what I think about knowing. We have to be curious, we have to share what we know, and we have to find collaborators because they always push us. The second thing we have to do is that we actually have to do. And the first part of my experience is that once we know things, we get asked to do things. As I said, it's the platform that engineers tend to stand on, and that knowing stuff tends to lead us to doing stuff, and that doing stuff tends to lead to us knowing more stuff, which actually it's a very tight loop. Knowing and doing, 70% of our learning is on the job. It's not surprising that that loop is quite so tight. But if we are to save civilization, what are the things that we actually need to do? Doing our projects is part of our work, but what are the other places where we can use our detailed knowledge to provide a platform for change? So I went to Buildings Day at COP21. I went to Buildings Day at COP21, and in one of the presentations somebody said about energy efficiency programs, if this is the low-hanging fruit, why haven't we picked it yet? And Buildings Day basically concluded that each major proportion of the built environment tends to blame the other. It's not possible to get strong regulations without the acceptance of the governed and an understanding of what's possible. It's not normal to produce buildings that are significantly better than code because it's too expensive and risky for owners, and design teams won't innovate unless they are set bigger goals than just do this, because there's actually no need to, and they've got commercial practices to run as well. So we have many, many ways to convene ourselves to do better. And the one that I've seen work best was the New York City Green Codes Task Force, which is the logo up in the top there. And this group convened all of the interested parties, from firemen to owners to design professionals to occupants to code officials, and worked over several months to propose and vet possible code changes that would support energy efficiency in New York City. And then Urban Green, which was the organization that convened that group, helped to drive them through City Council with the help of the City Council people who had asked us to do the work. It was supremely local, but it was really effective. It was actually getting all of those people into the room. We didn't end up having to convince ourselves or each other after the first couple of meetings. It was all more about, how do we make this better? How do we make this better at a price that everybody can afford and that everybody's prepared to accept? So I said that one of the two things that we really need to do is to work out how to change policy, and there's a lot of doing in changing policy, much of which is about framing the particular problem. So what do I mean by framing the problem? And I think it's really about understanding the problem that you're trying to solve. Why do I have a picture of chairs? It's a design question. Framing the problem is a design question. And Charles Eames, who designed these chairs, is very famous because he designed good chairs, but he's also famous for saying that design is largely a question of the design constraints that you apply, and that no design is actually good until it has understood all of the constraints and developed a means to deal with them. He's sort of depressing as a designer, but he says you've got to find all the constraints. He's very terse about it. There's a video on YouTube that has some very nice French lady asking very complicated questions, and he just says, find the constraints or the design will be terrible. He says it about 6 times, and eventually she gives up. But I think we're often a little slack about fully understanding our design problems. And we're even more slack about making sure that we stand up to people who want to design our way out of a stupid situation. So this is a London bus in Mississippi. And I don't know whether you can see the air conditioning unit that somebody has put on the back end of it. But it's a stupid situation. This is not something that we should really have been doing. And we don't stand up to this kind of nonsense in the way that we should. And it's a learned skill. Telling your clients that they are idiots is definitely a learned skill. Doing it nicely is even more of one. And I think it can really only be learned through doing. And it's about iterating our way through solutions, testing them against the constraints or the performance criteria. So the bus, sort of enough said, right? At a different level of problem framing, some of you will know that there was a debate at the Rumford Club last week around performance contracting. And the discussion centered around the idea that performance contracting should encourage innovation, get better results for clients and building teams, and help save civilization, but that it was almost impossible to pull off in the current construction industry environment because of the way that our work is segmented between design and construction and governed by things like standard of care and insurance and litigation. So this actually is a sort of chunky cross-disciplinary design problem that we need to frame or need to help frame with the others in our industry. What does the construction industry look like if it's to deliver better results for climate change? What is that? What does that look like? And can we get there from here? Which I think is not a given. But understanding this and framing this and putting this in context for the people that we work with and understanding how that happens, I think is the key thing we need to do. So we've known a bit, and I've talked about doing, so I'm going to move on to inhabiting. So as firms and individuals, we really do have the skills and the knowledge to work out the knowing and the doing bit. And of the two big things we have to do, applying the tools and getting the policy right, applying the tools is something that we have within our control, and while it needs that broad range of skill that I listed, it's something that we can actually do. The contract question, which is a part of getting the policy environment right, needs us to recruit all the help that we can get. So how do we recruit all the help that we can get? I think that it means that we have to get comfortable owning the problem and then inhabiting the roles of both leader and change agent. So our rocket scientists couldn't get a man to the moon and back on their own, but you have to bet that every time they spoke to somebody who might be able to get them to work on that project, they were advocating for that project. And what could be more exciting for anybody in that field of work? What could be more exciting for us as building services engineers to actually have a crack at saving civilization? If rocket scientists can do it, then so can we. Building services engineering is so much harder. So I'm going to take this in three pieces. Firstly, getting comfortable with leading, communicating, and then mobilizing the action. So leading. It's our job. Uncomfortable position up here. We are the experts in energy use in buildings, and unless you have lived under a rock or you're a resolute climate change denier, if you are a CIBSE Eng, you have all the information that you need for saving the world to be both your job and your obligation. But it can be a pretty big lift getting engineers to speak out. I was recently at a conference, the sustainability meeting of a large engineering society, and there was a constant undercurrent of sort of lack of confidence. The people in the room were basically enabling each other to say, well, you know, I'm a bit of an introvert and I'm a bit nerdy and I really can't solve this problem on my own. I am an off-the-scale introvert, and I have every sympathy with this point of view, but I've been a woman in engineering for a very long time, and it's shown me that it is actually absolutely possible to find the place to make the conversation happen. So I have lost count of the number of times that I've been asked to talk for all of those female engineers who are coming up, or to talk about what it's like to be a woman in engineering, and you end up as a sort of poster child for this thing. We should all be poster children for the climate change problem. It doesn't have to rest just where we think it might otherwise. So I think it's important that we really own the leadership role and make it our own. I thought I'd got there, but I was recently asked in my USGBC chair-elect role, so last year, what music I wanted to have playing when I came onto stage to make some remarks. And the President of the United States always comes on to Hail to the Chief, which, because he's the Chief, Commander-in-Chief. But what is my musical one-liner? Yeah, I told you I was going to talk about women in engineering. Forgot to press the slides. So what is my musical one-liner? What is your musical one-liner? It was actually very helpful to think this through. It's a sort of variation of the business school trope of determining your brand. Do you want to be known as the person who can get the ducts to fit no matter what? Or do you want to be the person who can help the design team get to zero net energy by helping everyone see that they have a contribution to make? You have to arrive at that leadership headline, and you have to do it for yourself. So that's about inhabiting. It's a pretty big step, and it's not very comfortable, and you don't take it unless somebody really pushes you into it. I didn't take it until somebody pushed me into it. You may have better behaviors. The second part of leading is about communicating, working out how to communicate and how to communicate clearly in a way that's both relatable and urgent. So there are all sorts of ways of getting to this, but one of the things that I did a long time ago, and this is actually where that chart that I showed on the first slide came from, is I worked with the AIA New York, the architects convening group in New York, to do an exhibition called Buildings Equals Energy, although it was always called E equals B, so I'm not quite sure. And one of the most powerful things that we did is they have a big picture window that opens out onto the street, and we made a sort of block of timber and a block of steel and a block of aluminum and a block of glass, and the blocks were sized such that they were the amount of material that you could produce from a fixed amount of oil. So the wood was kind of this big and the aluminum was this sort of size. And as a piece of communication, it was incredibly visual. It's like, oh, if we want to be low energy in the embodied energy of our buildings, timber's pretty good if you do it right, and aluminum is probably not really quite so good because you really don't get very much of it for your barrel of oil. So think about how we communicate things. What are the right ways to get things to move forward? And then the last little bit about leading is about mobilizing. As somebody said to me once on a leadership course, you cannot lead if you do not have followers. And followers only come when you are clear about what it is that you want to do. And so one of the best examples of mobilization around this, I think, is the adoption of LEAD and the LEAD rating system in the US. The system was developed through volunteer effort, and it was trialed in a pilot of just 10 projects. And the volunteers who wrote the first version of the system wanted to be in the pilot, both because it was good for their professional future and because they were, and mostly still are, mission-driven individuals. And the pilot was thoroughly oversubscribed, and as soon as the real system was released, demand began to pour in. And there were sort of two groups of people mobilized here, and they needed two different kinds of message. So the first group were the promoters. Although these were professionals in the field, they actually had no obligation to promote the system. It was about, for them, breaking out of a world where the design professional is expected only to do the least that we can do and provide a building that, as somebody in the industry said, if it were any worse, it would be illegal. And they wanted to raise the standard and to save civilization. So they were motivated by intrinsically motivated by wanting to save civilization, and as a result, they promoted LEAD. They didn't need much convincing, but they had to convince other people to take on LEAD, and the people that they needed to convince were the sort of hard-nosed developers. And one of the things that USGBC did was that they had to help the design professionals develop a message for that group. How do my promoters actually help sell this to the people who are going to do it? And they landed on this idea that sustainability is about people, profits, and planet. So rather than talking about social, economic, and environmental, which is how the bottom line is typically talked about, they talked about people, profits, and planet, and made it really clear that economic wasn't about just economic equity and all the other things that we are now much more interested in. It was really about profits. It was about, you don't have to wear a hair shirt in order to save civilization. And that it was a sort of genius bit of move in terms of getting the message out and convincing people to do it. So it's 16 years since the LEAD pilot, and USGBC still benefits from about 500,000 hours of volunteer time every year people give from within the industry. And this is sort of my example of how do you mobilize at a big scale. You have something that people can mobilize behind, and then you communicate well, and then you help them mobilize other people. It's about getting them, and then getting them to get people to follow. So where does this leave us? Climate change is a threat to civilization and is the biggest challenge of our generation. Building services engineers are a big part of solving it because they're about energy, but we're finding it really hard to do because it doesn't rely only on our core skills. So the two big things that we need to do are to use our tools properly and get the policy broader world behind us. And as firms and individuals, that means we need to do our stuff and to act on it. And these are the fairly easy engineering bits. I say easy in inverted commas. And then we have to inhabit the roles that we can have in the process, which is a much more difficult bit. And we can't avoid doing it because it's the challenge of our generation. So engineers are sometimes influential. It's not an unaccustomed role for us. There were lots of engineers who were very influential in the 19th century, which is why I've got a few of them up here. And I found the only woman I could find from the 19th century. And they were, engineers were in the popular consciousness. People knew who they were, and they had something that they very definitely wanted to do. And there are a few people now who have engineering backgrounds who are now in very strong positions of influence. And I'm told that most of you, but not me, will have heard of John Armitt and Anne Dowling and Terry Morgan because of the backgrounds that they have in engineering and the work that they are now doing to move policy and move things forward. And we need more of these kinds of people, those who are deep in understanding, but able to pivot to policy, whether that's inside or outside of practice. So we have a lot of engineers. We always have a little bit of a skills shortage. Maybe there are some of our engineers that we should actually push out, figure out how to train them well, how to communicate, and then help us from the other side. And then there are some, obviously, that we need to keep because we need to have the experts and the knowing and the doing. But we could organize ourselves so that we put engineers in other places than in practice, and that actually might be a very useful and powerful thing for us to do. So my last slide says, just to remind you that civilizations die from suicide and not murder, and so it's up to us. Thank you.